The most important thing we can do in order to get whatever success we want, build the best product you can. Invest all your energy in making the product absolutely best that you can think of. If you really focus on building an absolutely best product possible, everything else will follow.
Hey everyone, my name is Henry Suryawirawan, and you're listening to the Tech Lead Journal, the show where I'll be bringing you the greatest technical leaders, practitioners, and thought leaders in the industry to discuss about their journey, ideas, and practices that we all can learn and apply to build a highly performing technical team and to make an impact in your personal work. So let's dive into our journal. Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of the Tech Lead Journal with me, your host Henry Suryawirawan. Thanks for tuning in and spending your time with me today listening to this episode. For those of you who have participated in my recent giveaway, thank you for participating and subscribing to the show's mailing list. In the next few days, I will pick the 5 lucky winners to win the JetBrains All Products Pack personal licenses and make sure that I can reach you by your email address. And once confirmed, I will announce the winners on the Tech Lead Journal social media channels on LinkedIn, Twitter, and Instagram. Speaking of which, if you haven't subscribed to any of those channels, please take a quick pause right now, find the links in the show notes, and click the follow button in order to get updates from the show. Every day, I post insightful daily quotes from the week's episode to share some wisdom from my amazing guests and to give you some spark of idea or insight that you can implement right away. We are coming to the end of 2020, and this episode 20 is the last episode for the year. I'm going to take a 2-week break before continuing with the episode 21 on the 11th January 2021. I hope all of you can also spend some time to take a break and recharge your energy, especially after going through such a challenging year due to the pandemic. Maybe you can also take this time to do some retrospectives and possibly list down your New Year's resolution in order to improve yourself and achieve new goals and habits. I myself will also take a look back on this podcast progress, which has started 6 months ago, and I really appreciate your continued support for listening to me and the show. I would also like to take this opportunity to thank all my amazing guests who willingly spend their time to share their stories, knowledge, experience, and wisdom that we all can learn and apply to make an impact in our personal work. So thank you again, all of you, from the bottom of my heart. And for those of you who have found lots of inspirations from the show this year and are thinking of making contribution back to the show, please join us as a patron by going to techleadjournal.dev/patron, and you can help me towards achieving a goal that I'm currently running on the page. For today's episode, I am extremely excited to share my conversation with Arno Gourdol. Arno is an inspiring tech leader who has decades of experience working in 2 major creative companies, Apple and Adobe. He started his career journey at Apple straight after his internship there, and he had the fortune to work closely with Steve Jobs and experience firsthand when Steve came back to Apple and turn around the direction of the whole company to focus all their efforts on doing things that Apple was really good at and discarded the others. And this, as history showed, was the key success factor that brought Apple to where it is today. The entire company had to adapt to Steve Jobs' new ways of working and had to work in an iterative, fast-paced approach at the time when Agile was not yet widely known. During his time there, Arno also successfully led a complete rewrite of a 10-year-old Finder codebase to make it easier to maintain and evolve and ship it for macOS 10. After such successful career at Apple, Arno then moved to Adobe, where he spent almost 15 years of his career there, where he had the opportunities to explore different projects and establish his engineering leadership skills. Arno led an audacious move when he proposed Adobe to open source XMP, the extensible metadata platform, an action that was considered bold during the time when open sourcing wasn't common back then. XMP eventually became an ISO standard to store metadata for images, videos, and many other digital documents such as JPEG and PDF. There are so many interesting anecdotes and valuable lessons that I learned from Arno in this episode, including his advice on how to build products that people love and what we should focus on in order to create successful products. Right at the end, after his 3 tech lead wisdom, Arno shared with me what made him decide to end his illustrious career and pursue the things he is truly passionate about, which is about landscape photography and doing some passion open source projects. I hope that you will enjoy this great episode. Please consider helping the show in the smallest possible way by leaving me a rating and review on Apple Podcasts and other podcast apps that allow you to do so. Those ratings and reviews are one of the best ways to get this podcast to reach more listeners, and hopefully the show gets featured on the podcast platform. I'm also looking forward to hearing any comments and feedback on the social media, or you can also directly send to me at techleadjournal.dev/feedback. So let's get the episode started right after our sponsor message. Are you looking for a new cool swag? TechLead Journal now offers you some swags that you can purchase online. These swags are printed on demand based on your preference and will be delivered safely to you all over the world where shipping is available. Check out all the cool swags available by visiting techleadjournal.dev/shop. And don't forget to brag yourself once you receive any of those swags. Hello everyone, welcome back to another Tech Lead Journal show. Today I'm so excited to meet Arno Gourdol. I hope I pronounced the name correctly. I was introduced to Arno by one of my best friends. Looking at Arno's profile is pretty stunning. Arno has a very illustrious career working at 2 big creative companies, I would say. The first one was Apple for around 10 years, and the other one is Adobe, which is about 14-15 years. So looking at this illustrious career, I would say Arno is pretty credible people that I can interview in this podcast. And hopefully today, Arno will be able to share lots of insights, lots of career story from his career for all of us to learn. So welcome, Arno, to the show.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
So Arno, what are you doing now? I know that you are not currently in any career now. You're doing your own stuff. So tell us a little bit more. What are you up to these days?
Yeah, right now, what I'm doing is trying to do as much travel as I can, which this year has been challenging, definitely. But I try to travel and do some landscape photography, which is one of my passions. I try to take pictures that showcase the beauty, the natural beauty that's out there in the world, and try to share it with the world. When I'm not doing that, I'm also working on some open source projects for various things that I care about, and a lot of those that have no commercial value and that I could not have worked on otherwise. But now that I don't have that constraint anymore, I work on some of those open source projects.
So let's go back to your career. Looking at your career, maybe you can share with us what are some major highlights and maybe turning points in your career that are interesting for us to hear about.
Yeah, well, my career started very interestingly, unexpectedly, I would say. When my career started, I was actually going in a very different direction than where I ended up with. I was studying for an engineering degree at my university, degree that was both in software engineering and computer-human interaction, which has always been my passion. That's something that I've always been deeply interested in, and interested in the potential for technology to really help people be more creative, do more, express themselves. It's always been something fascinating to me, and making that technology accessible is something that I've always really cared about. I started hacking on the Apple II back when I was in high school, and that was sort of like my opening to that whole universe. And then when the Mac got out in 1984, the first time I saw a Mac, that was a revelation. I saw that and I was like, okay, this is the future. This is how computers are going to be from now on. There's no doubt in my mind. That was the first thing I thought. And then the second thing is I have to have one. I got to put my hands on it and do something with it, which I ended up doing. I managed to get a Mac the first year that it came out, and I started programming on it and building applications on it. That was about the same time that I was working on my undergrad studies. And, it was like intro to computer science. And at the time, I was a little bit bored by those classes, I must admit. I figured that actually building applications at the same time was a good way to sort of distract myself. So I ended up doing that and publishing some of those very early Mac apps back then. And then after that, I started working on this graduate degree that was focusing on user interaction. And we're talking about like early 90s. But at the time, it was very ambitious, let's say, because it was all about voice, speech recognition, gestures, how to use all of that with a computer. And the big challenge at the time is that the hardware was not really capable of doing that. And I don't know, at one point I was like, I bet the company that could help me with this is Apple. So I'm going to get in touch with them and I'm going to ask them, hey, do you guys have any hardware that I could play with that could help me with this? And to my surprise, they actually ended up responding and saying, well, as it turns out, we do have a project that we're going to get started on. And if you're interested, we can take you on for an internship. I was like, oh, wow. I did not expect that positive answers. And that's exactly what I'm looking for. So I talked to my thesis advisor about it. And she was very supportive. She said, this is a great opportunity. But she told me, you're never coming back. And I'm like, what? What do you mean? Of course I'm coming back. No, this is just for the summer. This is just for a couple of months. That's going to help me, make some progress on the thesis and all that. She's like, yeah, no, I'm never going to see you again. I'm like, all right, well, we'll see. And it turns out that she was right. After a few months at Apple, I got completely hooked. I was like, this is great. I'm actually working on things that millions of people are actually going to be using. And that's a fantastic feeling to think that you're building something that is really going to make a difference in people's lives. I mean, not that the academic world doesn't have its value as well. But, for me, that was just completely different. And so Apple ended up extending my internship a few times and eventually just telling me, you should just stick around. We're going to hire you as a full-time employee and keep on going. So that's sort of how I got started at Apple. And that was the beginning of my career. And that was a big turning point and unexpected one, like I said.
So it must be a dream for you. The first time you saw Mac, you got hooked by it. You think, oh, this is like the future of computing. I mean, I didn't have a chance to have the first Mac, obviously. I can understand at that point in time, Mac probably is one of the more advanced, sophisticated technology that came out. And to be able to do an intern in a company of your dream product is something that I think it's really, really amazing. So tell us, after your internship, how did you actually start? What kind of role you started at Apple? What product that you built?
Like I said, I was an intern, really low on the totem poles. Basically, I was just happy to be there. I remember the first time I realized that I actually have access to the source code of macOS. That was just like mind-blowing for me, and just being able to read that on my spare time, that was just wonderful. I did a lot of that. I would spend my nights and weekends just reading to that code and just being fascinated by it and learning so much from it. But it turns out that Apple did have a project at the time for a pen-based Mac. So it was essentially like a Mac portable that had a touchscreen on it. That was a product that Apple was working on. It hadn't shipped yet. And that was sort of like going on at the same time that Newton was going on, if you remember that. So they had those two projects in parallel. And I worked on the Mac-based one. I wrote some of the gesture recognizers for that computer, some of the UI that we're building on it. Now, that was interesting because that gave me access to this hardware that I was looking for, so that was wonderful. I worked on that for a little while. The project ended up being canceled, which happens a lot. And this time, especially with the Newton being going on at the same time, they decided that it didn't make sense to sort of have both, and they bet on Newton as being the one project. After that, I was still part of the UI group that's working on all the UI components of the Mac. That included the Finder, the system preferences, all the things that are visual that you interact with in the Mac. That was the team that was working on that. And so I ended up taking up some responsibility for some of those components. One of the first one was the open and save dialogues. That's still part of the Mac to this day. I was responsible for icons as well. So everything to do with icons on the Mac, I worked on that. And it was sort of like a gradual progression. At first, I was intern, and then I got promoted to software engineer. So I was working on smaller components. And then things sort of started accumulating with more components I was responsible for. And then eventually also being part of a team, working with people, just not on my own, but starting to work in the context of a bigger team as well. So it was like a gradual progression as time went on.
So during this time, was it with Steve Jobs inside, or Steve Jobs was out of the company?
That was before Steve came back. So that was interesting. That was a very interesting time to sort of be at Apple at the time. It was a challenging time for Apple as well. Apple wasn't always doing that well back then. One of the bigger challenges was that Apple was trying to build a new operating system from scratch that was supposed to be the successor to the Mac operating system from 1984. And it was a big endeavor. It was a huge project, and that project was not going very well. Apple was making some progress, but there were lots of problems with it as well. It wasn't moving as quickly as everyone was hoping. My team, the UI team, we had lots of ideas for what we wanted to do and build on top of this new operating system. And we felt a little bit constrained because we're like, okay, come on, guys, we need to ship. If we don't have the OS, we can't ship. And after a while, I ended up being so frustrated with the progress, I ended up making a recommendation. I said, I don't think we can pull it off. I don't think, given the complexity of what we're trying to build, I don't think we're set up in terms of process and know how to do a project this size. And I think we would be better off just buying an OS from somewhere else and then build on top of that, making our own, but give us a head start by just buying something. And at the time, actually, the recommendation I made was we should buy BOS. I don't know if you remember BOS, a small operating system that had been started by Jean-Louis Gasset. He used to be at Apple, had left Apple and started this company to build this desktop operating system that was very advanced for the time. It had multi-threading, full multitasking, was very high performance, which is all the things that we were kind of looking for in a new operating system. And it was already there. It was built, it was working, it was shipping. B themselves wasn't doing very well because it's really hard to do something like that from scratch and be successful commercially. I was like, that would make sense. Buy them and then build on top of that, and that could become the next version of macOS. And to my surprise, people were like, yeah, I guess that makes sense. We should definitely look at that. And investigation started, and the discussions were fairly advanced. There was an offer that was made, but people were like, we should look at what the other options are as well and make sure that this is really the best for us. Maybe B seems to be asking for a lot of money for what they have. Maybe we can find something less expensive, or is the price really justified, and so on. And that's how it was decided to actually look at Next as another option. Next, which was the company founded by Steve when he left Apple the first time, that also had a great operating system that could be a foundation as well. Now, they were not for sale or anything. They were not trying to get themselves sold, but they were a good comparative to what we're looking to be OS. And then Steve, being such a good salesman, he ended up actually convincing everyone else at Apple that that was the right thing to do. The thing that made sense was for Apple to actually buy Next and for Steve to come back at Apple. So that's what ended up happening. Yeah, really interesting time when this whole transition happened.
It must be one of the best moments in your career. I must say that looking back, you were around when Steve was not around. And when he came back as the CEO, what was the first thing you remember in your mind? What change that he made?
So there was actually a transition as well, because Steve came back, but at first he was not CEO. He was sort of like advisor to the current CEO at the time. And it's sort of like over time that he ended up taking more responsibility and eventually becoming interim CEO and then full-fledged CEO. But when he got this title of interim CEO and he was more like in charge, the first thing he did, which was a bit of a shock to the system, to be fair, for everyone at Apple, was canceling projects left and right. At first, we were like, oh my God, what is he doing? We're going down the drain. He's canceling everything. The company's over. What's happening? It was all very disorienting. But Steve's idea was that Apple was just doing too many things. We had lots of different projects going on, both on the hardware side and on the software side. It was just too much. We were just stretched too thin. In order for Apple to really be successful, it was important to focus on fewer things. To just decide what are the things that are really important, those things we're going to do, and the things that are maybe good ideas that would be nice projects to do, we're just going to have to cancel so that we can focus all our efforts, all our energy on those critical projects. And so that's what happened. That's when Newton got canceled. There were some great other projects, OpenDog and CyberDog at the time, which got canceled as well. Lots of hardware projects that got canceled. But it was all, I think, the right thing to do. And certainly history proved that. By focusing on fewer things, we were able to produce higher quality work.
I know it must be a very tough decision looking at so many projects and then canceling one by one. But what was the principles behind it? What made it such a success at the end of the day?
I think it was really focusing on those things that Apple could do that was difficult for other companies to do. When you step back and you think about, well, what is special about Apple? at the time back then, but it's true to this day, was the fact that Apple was really one of the very few companies that really looked at building a product as a complete thing, meaning both the hardware and the software that goes with it. Apple wasn't a hardware company that got its software from somewhere else and then tried to make it run on top of it, or a software company that ran onto whatever hardware others were producing. Apple was unique in that it was a company that was building a product that had a hardware component and a software component, but those two were built to really work together. And that was exemplified with the iMac, which was the first product that Steve really worked on when he came back at Apple, by saying we're going to be building this new kind of hardware that is custom fit to work with the software that's going to be running on it as well. And the two are going to be running really closely together so that you can have this machine that makes it like really easy to connect to the internet. That was the whole idea of the iMac. That was the I in iMac, was to make it a machine that was really easy to connect on the internet. And for that to work, you had to have both the hardware and the software work together. And so that was the key idea that was sort of driving which projects made sense for Apple and which ones didn't.
So you mentioned as well during our introduction that during this time you were working in such an incredible pace. Changes seems to be a norm. And we were kind of like discussing this is like pre-agile, but you work in an agile manner anyway. So could you tell us what was it like building products and introducing a lot of changes throughout the process?
Yeah, that was really interesting because at the time, Apple was a pretty large company. And the way to approach actually building products was relatively conservative, I would say. The whole approach to product design, certainly on the hardware side, because when you build hardware, it's different than when you work on software projects. Hardware side, you have physical constraints. When you make a prototype, it takes time to build that prototype, and it's very difficult to make changes to that prototype. You have to retool things, and that takes time as well, and so on. So the whole approach on the hardware side is very methodical for how you build your product. But some of that approach had leached through on the software side as well. So the software projects also were very conservative. It had waterfall type of methodology. You wrote specs before you wrote the first line of code. And then you check that after you've written the whole software, you made sure that the software actually matched the spec. So it was a different approach from what we're using today, more agile methodologies. But the thing that changed that was when Steve actually came back, because he was so involved in the creation of the products themselves. He was obviously relying on a very talented team of engineers and designers and so on. So it's not like he was designing all the product himself from scratch, but he had a very good vision and understanding for what customers were looking for and what customers wanted, sometimes better than the customers themselves would know if you asked them. Steve could sort of like intuit that, what people were actually looking for. He was invaluable in giving feedback to direct the product in the right direction. But what he couldn't do, he couldn't at the beginning of the project tell you, okay, well, this is exactly what we're going to build. This is exactly what it's going to look like. Now go do it. It was very much a reactive experience where you build a prototype and you would bring it to him and try something out, and that would spark an idea or the feedback. It would say, oh yeah, this is really good. Or yeah, no, that doesn't really work. That would lead things in different directions. So by nature, it was very iterative. I had a weekly design review meeting with Steve where we would bring in basically the latest state of the system, and he would actually just play with it and try it out and discuss things and look at different options, see which one felt were more promising. And that was sort of like the feedback cycle that we used for the next iteration. But it was a very different approach from what the software engineering team at Apple had done. When I realized that, okay, this is how we're going to work now, one of the big challenges for me was like, okay, I have to explain to my team, which was the UI team, that this is what's going to happen. Because they would come to me and say, okay, so what are we building? What are we supposed to build? And like, we don't know yet. There's no spec, and there's never going to be a spec. So we had to approach how we're building software differently. And I would tell them, we have to think more of building components that are inherently flexible so we can rearrange them in different ways as we try things, as we find that some things work or don't work, so we can make those changes constantly. One metaphor that I used to explain that was it's like building Lego pieces, where we're going to be making like this huge sculpture. We don't know exactly what it's going to look like yet, but we know that we'll need those smaller pieces. So let's start by building those, putting them together, see what pieces we need that we don't have, build those until we have something complete. That was, again, a big change from what we were used to, but eventually the team got into it and it worked out pretty well because that's how the first version of macOS 10 eventually came out.
I'm sure this is a good learning for all of us here as well. As we all know, startups are booming these days. A lot of people wants to start a startup, but they don't necessarily know what kind of product they want to build. Not exactly for sure, but they have a direction. Maybe they have a vision. So in your view, as a technical leaders at that time, not knowing what to build, what would be a good tips from you to give technical leaders these days that if you don't know what to build exactly, what kind of tips that they should know in mind in order to be able to still come up with a good engineering product and good engineering design, and which probably will lead to a good product and good success for the company as well?
I would say that one of the key things was not to be overly ambitious when you get started, not starting to make assumptions that may end up being invalidated later. Starting small, that's definitely something that worked very well. Trying to do small things and not trying to do something that's too broad either. So to give you an example, when we started working on the Aqua, which was the macOS 10 user interface, that was actually the first meeting that I had with Steve. He came prepared. He had no idea what the UI actually was going to be like, all of that. But what he told us is we're going to be working on buttons, windows, and menu. Those are sort of like the basic building block. We have to figure out what those things are. And then once we have that, the rest will follow. But rather than trying to do everything at once, all the components and elements that you can have in a UI and try to figure it all out at the same time, let's try to figure like one button. You can't have something simpler than a button. So let's figure out how do we want the button to work in this UI. And once we have that, then we'll move on to windows and then menus, because those are the building blocks, and then we'll do the rest. Again, that goes back to this idea of focus, both in terms of at the product level, but also in how you're building the product and saying, when you build a UI, that's something that's really complicated. How do you simplify it? How do you make it so that you can focus on fewer things, do those things really well, not get distracted by all the possible different directions that you could go to, all the different problems that are out there, but try to make a solid foundation that you can build on and develop from.
So I think the last project from your profile I saw is to revamp the Mac Finder, if that is right. And looking at the history as well, Mac Finder has been around since maybe, I don't know, like early version of Mac OS.
Yep.
And then for you to be able to revamp from scratch, rewrite the whole thing, and plus introducing a new way of interactions for people to use Finder, I foresee that there are a lot of challenges as well, especially new interactions, maybe new styling, new placement of things.
Yes.
So what will be the best tips for you for people who wants to embark this kind of a journey? Maybe rewrite the whole thing, revamp, restyle the whole thing in order to get it right so that the users are not to the opposite of what you want, right? They are angry, they're mad in terms of building the end product.
That is a great question. And that was certainly something that caused us a lot of anxiety when we started the project. The old Finder, I would say, the Finder that was running on macOS System 7 and versions previous to macOS 10, it was a beast. It was a gigantic piece of software, way more complicated than you would think from just playing with it. It was also actually, interestingly, as far as I know, one of the first large-scale C++ apps. It had started to be written just at the time that C++ came out. There was like no framework or anything at the time. So the Finder sort of had its own system of doing things, its own way that had been invented by the team back then as they needed. Because the code base was so large and so old, it had become really difficult to make changes to it. Going back to what we were talking earlier about needing to make all those changes and introduce all those new interactions and so on. At first, we were like, okay, well, maybe we can sort of like retrofit that in the existing code base and get it to work. But I became convinced that just wasn't going to work, that we were going to be fighting so much the code base to get it to do what we wanted, that we would waste so much time, that we would be better off rewriting it from scratch. Usually, when you have an engineer that comes along and says, we have to rewrite everything, the reaction is, okay, yeah, you're crazy, we're not doing that. Especially with a product that has such history. Because like you said, there were a lot of subtle user interactions that users were used to and expecting that could be difficult to reproduce. And I made that pitch. I said, I think that's the only way. I'm convinced that if we rewrite it from scratch, we'll be able to go faster, we'll be able to do more, we'll be able to catch up to where the code base currently is, and then move further where we want to go better than if we just stay with the current code base. So I didn't win that argument outright. I think my management was rightfully skeptical, and I convinced them enough that they were like, okay, we're going to give it a try, but we're going to keep our options open. So we're going to have sort of the classic code base. We're going to try to move it forward. And then you and a few engineers, you go ahead and prove to us that you can actually rebuild it and do it faster. And so that's what we ended up doing. And it did work the way I was hoping, which is that the new code base ended up being so much easier to work with, so much more flexible, that we were able to really quickly catch up to the capabilities that the old Finder had, but in a much more flexible and better organized and architected component based on everything that we had learned from the old Finder, that we were able to catch up and go much further. But it was a very controversial decision. We had sort of those parallel efforts for a while. And eventually people were like, okay, we're convinced, we're abandoning the old code base, we're going to bet on this new code base. But it took some convincing by actually building things and demonstrating that it was possible and it could work.
This is a classic kind of a problem for every engineer. Oh, you look at the piece of code, old enough, maybe even 2-3 years is old enough for an engineer, and they decide, oh, we have to rewrite and rebuild this. But I think most of the times it's not a valid argument for sure. So in your case, what do you think in this modern era for people who come up, okay, I need to rewrite something? What will be some of the criteria for them to actually judge whether the effort is worth it or not?
In my landscape photography hobby, there is a little bit something similar, which has to do with your equipment, with your gear. People often ask me, what camera should I buy? What camera do you use? What lenses and all of that? When I tell people, I say, you should not buy a new lens or a new body or new camera if you can't explain what is it you're going to be able to do with this new camera or this new lens that you can't do right now. Because the new camera, the new lens, they're not magically going to make better images. If you don't understand what are the limitations of what you're working with right now, then there's no point. You're just wasting money. And I think it's the same thing when you're looking at rewriting software, re-architecting it, and so on. Sometimes I totally get that. Sometimes it's tempting. You're like, oh my God, this thing is terrible, and it could be so much better. But if you can't answer the question, in what way is it going to be better? What is it going to allow you to do this new architecture that you can't do right now? Then it's probably not worth it. So I would definitely not recommend to just rewrite things just for the sake of it. Sometimes a piece of code that's old and clunky, but it works, that's good enough. Don't touch it. In this case, I knew that the code base that we had, we just could not move it in the direction that we wanted. And that's what justified doing this rewrite. I was not enthusiastic about this rewrite either, but I really saw that as the only way to do what we wanted with the risks that were associated with it.
Wow, nice analogy. I like the photography analogy, not buying lenses if you don't know what you're doing. And then, it's pretty insightful for us not to just judge, oh, there's a new technology, like maybe Kubernetes or whatever it is. Let's just rewrite everything to just adopt that technology. I think your message is pretty spot on. Know what you want, what kind of limitations that you currently have that you cannot avoid. And then before you actually embark the journey to rewrite or re-architect or re-platform your system. This is 10 years journey of Apple before you move to Adobe, which you spent about 15 years. So tell us more about Adobe's experience, maybe some highlights, maybe turning points.
Yeah, so that was definitely an interesting career as well at Adobe. The reason why I ended up transitioning to Adobe, well, first, the two companies have always been very close, both in terms of the people who work there. You have people going back and forth between Apple and Adobe all the time, but also in terms of how they approach the products that they build and the customers they build it for. There's obviously a lot of intersection between the people that buy Apple products and Adobe products. One thing that I had gotten more interested over time while working at Apple, which was about managing people and providing leadership to engineering teams. That's something that I found increasingly interesting. When I was at Apple, I was managing some people back then, but it wasn't the focus of what I was doing. And I just wanted to do more of that and learn more about how do you become a good manager? What is a good manager in the engineering field? And so that's what I started doing at Adobe. Again, that was a great career progression. I got extremely lucky. One of the wonderful things about Adobe is that the company is large enough that there are so many different projects that you can get the opportunity to work on, and new projects all the time as well. you basically never get bored. I mean, unless you want to. And some people at Adobe, specialize. And you have some people that have been working on Photoshop since the beginning of Photoshop, and they love it. And that's the only thing they want to do. And they do that, and they're great at it. And that's wonderful. But for me, I wanted to also try different things. And I really love working with new products as well. That's always been a passion of mine and something that I always found interesting and challenging. And Adobe offered plenty of opportunities for that. I got to work on tons of great products for creative, from Photoshop, which was the first product I worked on when I joined Adobe, to some new products. I worked on the XMP metadata initiative, which was very interesting because it started as something like extremely mundane, I would say. It was all about how can you represent metadata, the location that something was created and the author of something and so on, across all sorts of different media, because the people who use Adobe products, they create photos, they make magazine layouts, they create illustrations, and all sorts of those different things. But they all have this need to have metadata to represent that information and attach it with all those documents. So how do you do that across all those different type of documents? And so there was this proposal to have this new format to do it. And I was like, yeah, that's kind of interesting, but that's never going to work if that's the new Adobe format. It has to be something for it to really work, to be universal so that anybody can use it, no matter what products they're using, whether they're using Adobe products or not. That has to be possible to use that. And so I ended up making, again, which at the time was sort of like a crazy pitch, which was, we should open source this. And it was like in the early 2000s. At the time, open source wasn't what it is today. So the first thing I often had to do was stop by explaining what open source was. And then, I would have people look at me funny. What are you talking about? We're going to be building all this and we're going to be giving it away? Yes, we are, because that's the only way that it can succeed, and we'll get the benefit from it. If everybody uses it, that will be great for the whole ecosystem. But we can't do that if we just keep it to ourselves. Again, I got lucky. I got the support for it, and we ended up doing this project, which was called XMP, and that ended up becoming like an ISO standard, and that ended up being adopted by literally everyone. I mean, I remember visiting Canon, the camera makers in Japan, where they were like, we're going to put XMP in our cameras. I'm like, oh, wow. I did not anticipate that. I did not expect that, but that's really cool. On a lot of cameras now, you can push a little star button to rate your images. That's XMP, actually, behind the scene. That makes all of that possible. That was really exciting to be working on that. And that was an opportunity also for me to get started also getting involved on the standard size of things and a world that I didn't really know. But it was interesting to discover as well, to see how all of that works. And then later on, I would do more of that also while at Adobe.
So this is very interesting story coming from a traditional, or maybe during that time, not many companies are into the open source yet. I could even remember during my time when I was early in my career, open source was really not deemed as secure. There are a lot of scrutiny. Why are we using, open source software? You should just buy from vendor, have support, and then deem more secure rather than open source. Although now times have changed, definitely. But for some companies who just use open source software, but rather than building open source libraries or software back to the community, why do you think it's important for every company to do this initiative?
So in the case of XMP, that was a good example where if you wanted to benefit from better ecosystem, essentially, you had to contribute to this ecosystem in a way that was making improvements that everybody could benefit from, not just something that would be better for your products. I think that's more and more true because software nowadays interoperates. I mean, it's not like your customers are using just your software and nothing else. So being able to have something that works with lots of different things is important. Now, it's a difficult pitch for a commercial company, right? To say, we're going to be building something, we're going to be investing time and resources into building something, and then we're just going to be giving it away. But I think that you can make that argument. I mean, it doesn't make sense for everything, obviously, but I think it does make sense for a lot of things when by the contribution that you make, you're going to be improving the overall ecosystem so that you can benefit from that better ecosystem and others can as well. And you're going to be competing with your competitors who can provide the best solution for that ecosystem. But if the ecosystem doesn't exist, if it's not there, nobody wins. There's just no product that can be built at all. The other thing, which I believe as well, and that's a little bit more controversial, and I get it that not everybody buys into that, but I think that when you're a company of a certain size, like Adobe is only, you benefit from the work that others in the open source community are doing, whether it's directly when you reuse a piece of open source software because it does what you need, or because others have contributed to this enrichment of this ecosystem in one way or the other. It's great. You benefit from it. That's fine. That's fair. That's the way it works. But I think you sort of have a moral obligation to contribute back as well. You take some, but you should give back. I think that's only fair. Now, I understand that not every company can do it. If you're a small startup that is strapped for resources and just doesn't have the time and the funding, you may not be able to do that. But I think if you reach a certain level of success, which again, that success very often will have been built on the contribution of others that have contributed to the open source community, when you can, I think you should give back and contribute something back. So those are sort of like the two arguments. I strongly believe in both of them. But like I said, I know that the second one is definitely a bit more controversial and not everyone agrees with that.
So the way I see it, I think it's kind of fair as well. Like these days, I mean, as a developer, especially the new one, if they want to build any kind of software, you could easily just start by typing few commands, and then you can download the whole bunch of dependencies. It could be hundreds even, and then they can start building something. I think at some point in time, it's kind of like fair if you know that something you can contribute back, either like small fixes to the dependencies that you use. I think it's fair for you to contribute back. Doesn't have to be necessarily like a big open source project. In your Adobe experience as well, right, you work on few different products and not necessarily products that are long lasting. Some of them like Adobe Air and Adobe Flash now pretty much not existent anymore. I wanted to ask this question, like for some people, of course, they are sometimes unfortunate as well working in the products that probably got killed or something like that. So what will be your learning throughout this experience, working on a project, a big product, then suddenly got killed?
I think the most important thing is not to get attached, not to lose perspective about why you're doing what you're doing. Because then you can get stuck in a direction that may not be the right direction and get terribly disappointed and crushed when your product or project or whatever ends up getting canceled and so on. I mean, it's good to be passionate about what you're doing. I think that's really important. But you have to sort of examine, why is it important? What is it really that you're trying to accomplish? And oftentimes it's not about the specific of the product, but there's a bigger idea behind it. For example, Flash, that's a great example. The reason why I thought that Flash was so interesting, and I enjoyed working on it despite all its challenges, but the thing that was great about it is what people were doing with it. It's the creativity that it enabled others to express, whether it was building games or incredible experiences on the web. At the time, the web was just not very capable. And Flash enabled those developers to build those amazing experiences. And that's something that was very powerful. The thing that I was really interested in wasn't Flash in itself. It was being able to build those experiences. While I was working on the Flash runtime and I was leading that effort, I came to realize, given that how things were evolving, and that's when mobile devices started to come on the scene. And of course, the iPhone, which, famously with Steve refusing to have Flash on the iPhone, I love that. I started thinking and realized, if you look at the trajectory, if you say 5 years or 10 years from now, or maybe 15 years from now, it ended up being less than 15 years, actually. Is Flash going to still be around? Probably not, but people will still want to build those great experiences. How can we help people build those great experiences? And that's when I realized that the right thing to do was for Adobe to actually invest in web standards, because that was the future. That was what was going to enable people to build those great experiences, even if the technology that they used to do it changed, but the fundamental need that people had wasn't going to change. And so I made that argument again. I keep putting myself in the situation where you have to make those pitches, but things that seems right to me, but are often go against the conventional wisdom. I mean, if you can imagine, I was at Adobe and I was making the pitch that we should kill Flash and invest in web standards. And I was in charge of Flash. So you can imagine how that went. So same thing, there was a lot of skepticism when I made that pitch. But, again, I managed to convince people enough that there was an agreement that, okay, maybe we should try to make some investment in web standards and see how that goes. And so we ended up doing that. And I started getting more involved with the W3C, the CSS working group in particular, and making some proposals there that were about making the web better and sort of filling in some of the gaps that the web had so that we could have a better platform to allow people to express themselves.
I think the last position that you have at Adobe is senior director of a suite of products. So at this level, especially when you're working on different products, I could imagine that it's pretty difficult to probably manage all of them. But what will be the key success factor from your experience or your view when you are in this position, having to manage multiple different products, not necessarily working together, but some could. But what are the critical things at this position as the director of product?
Yeah, one of the most important things is to trust your teams because you're right. As you progress in your career and your portfolio becomes larger and larger, there's only so much that you can get directly involved in. You're still ultimately responsible for the success or failure, more likely, of your products. Meaning, if everything goes well, it's because your team did a great job. If things don't go well, it's because you didn't do your job. That's how it is, really. So you have to trust your teams that they're going to be doing a great job. And what your team needs from you is clarity of purpose. You end up spending so much time communicating. That's the most important thing. And you end up, maybe sometimes you feel like you're just repeating yourself, but really what you're doing is you're providing clarity to your teams in helping them understand what is important, what is the goal, what is it that we're trying to achieve, and why is it important, why is it worth doing. Your teams can figure out how we're going to do that. If you have great teams, they will build a great product. But you have to help them understand why this product is important and what is behind what they're trying to build. That's the most important thing. And that's definitely worth spending a lot of time on.
Looking at your illustrious career, again, having worked at Adobe and Apple, these two are the giants in terms of building products that people love, that people use either for their creative work or it's just like fanaticism. When you talk about Apple users, they are fanatic about it. And even some Adobe users as well, like Photoshop, I think is still one of the best product available for manipulating images. In your view, again, what will be some tips for building products that delight people, first of all, in terms of UX and UI experience, and also giving people a lot of values, fanatism, so that they are attached to your product, your brand, and your company together?
Yeah, when Steve came back at Apple, I guess Apple wasn't doing very well financially. And there were a lot of people at Apple, me included, that were wondering, hey, should we stick around? Should we maybe go join a startup somewhere? Is Apple going to be around next month? And I actually ended up asking Steve about that. I said, Steve, what's going on? Is the stock going to turn around? I mean, is our options going to be worth something someday? And Steve had this great answer. He said, don't worry about all that. Don't worry about the financial rewards or what the stock is going to do. Don't worry about even pleasing your customers. All of those things are not what's important. All of those things are the things that happen if you've built something that's great. So the most important thing we can do in order to get whatever success we want, whether it's financial rewards or, like you said, the customers that are really passionate about your products, that really love them, build the best product you can. Invest all your energy in making the product absolutely best that you can think of. Don't worry about what your competitors are doing. Don't worry about what criticism you may get from maybe your current customers that are not happy about something or other. All of those things are distractions, really. If you really focus on building an absolutely best product possible, everything else will follow. You'll have happy customers. They'll be happy to give you money to buy your products. And investors will be happy to buy stock in your company because they want to be part of the journey as well.
I know that this is such a great conversation so far, but I would like to ask the last questions that I have in this show normally, which is the technical leadership wisdom. So do you have any wisdom from your journey throughout these 25 years of career? What are the most important things for us technical leaders to know about?
Well, one of the first things that I learned, which was a surprise, was the importance of stepping up. I found myself so many times in situations where, I'd look around me, someone should be doing something about this. And realizing that nobody was doing anything about this, I'm like, well, maybe I should be the one doing something about it. We've talked about some of those opportunities where I made some crazy proposals, things for me that were like, I think that's the right thing. Nobody else maybe is speaking up and saying it, but that's what I think is the right thing. That is something that has served me so well so many times, that has helped me really progress in my career in ways that I couldn't have otherwise. It's very easy to be in a situation where you're like, well, things are just the way they're supposed to be. What can I do about it? And then you realize that, in fact, you can do a lot about it. You'd be surprised, but you just have to be willing to step up and say, hey, I know how to fix this, or I have an idea, or I think we're doing something wrong. And oftentimes that will open up opportunities for you to do more than you thought possible. So I would definitely encourage anybody, especially someone that's early in the career, to not hesitate to speak up. I mean, you have to do it in a respectful way, obviously. But more often than not, I think you realize that people will value in different perspectives. And you may have an idea that nobody else had that is worth contributing. So don't hesitate to speak up and contribute. Now, don't think that you always have the answers either. And oftentimes, I was the last one to think that I was right. And I was like, I don't know what I'm talking about. That sounds right to me. But, if anybody thinks differently or think I'm wrong, speak up, let me know. So you have to be very humble in how you approach this. But yeah, definitely stepping up and be willing to contribute and take responsibility that nobody else is willing to step up for. So that's one thing. Another thing is the importance of teamwork as well. You can do a lot by yourself. You may be very talented and able to do a lot of work on your own, but you can do so much more when you're in a team of other talented people that can contribute and help out. Now, one key thing is not everybody is alike. Not everybody has the same talent. Nobody is talented at everything either. Some people are better at some things than others. One of the key things is first, recognizing that. I've seen many instances of people that would get frustrated because their teammate would not do something and they'd be like, but, why isn't he doing this? He should do this. He's supposed to do this. As the manager, I would have to explain, well, yeah, but they're not very good at it. Do you want them to try to do a terrible job at something that you're really good at? No, you're really good at this thing. You should be the one doing it. They're not really good at it. Let them do the things that they're really good at. And that's important to recognize, that people are good at different things and to give them a job that's basically aligned with that. Don't ask them to do things that they're not passionate about, that they're not going to be doing a great job of. Make sure that those things that they're really good at, that they can really blossom into and really flourish. And if you think of the whole team as a whole, you need the team to have all sorts of different talents. And sometimes you have gaps, right? You have, wow, we're a fantastic team of architects and we design some great software, but we suck at managing our schedule. We never ship on time. It's always disorganized. Don't say, okay, you, from now on, you're in charge of the schedule and you ask an architect to do that, because they're going to be doing a terrible job of it. What that means is you may need to bring somebody in on the team that has those particular skills that you lack. So that's really important, to think of the team as a whole and make sure that the team as a whole has all the right skills, but don't ask people to do things that they're really not the most talented at. And if you do that, then you can create a great team that can really do some amazing work. And then you can be so much more productive than you could be if you try to do everything yourself, which is sometimes a temptation as well for engineers, right? When you're like, we don't like this and this is not done right. I know how to do it. I'm just going to fix it. Sometimes it's so much better to actually help somebody to learn how to do it right than to fix it yourself. And then finally, I would say, again, it goes back to some things that we talked about earlier. Choose to only do your best work and choose what you work on. We all only have so much time on this earth. So it's very important to choose how you're going to be spending your time. What are you going to be working on? Are you working on something that's worth it, that's going to make a difference? If you do that, you end up happier, certainly, when you do something that you feel matters to you and is important to you. That's also when you tend to do your best work. It's very difficult to do some really great work when you're working on something that you're not that interested in or that passionate about, or you think is kind of a waste of time. Being selective in what you choose to work on is really important.
This is just a guess. Could that be the reason why you chose to end your career and do the photography?
It actually is. You're exactly right. You're absolutely right. I really enjoyed my career, both at Apple and Adobe. It was very rewarding. It was really something that I've got a lot of satisfaction out of, and I really enjoyed doing for a long time. But yeah, I had reached that point where I ended up asking my question. The answer was, what would I rather do? Would I rather work on this new project, which is sort of interesting, but this is also something that I've kind of done before? Or is there something else that I would rather sort of explore and learn and do? And the answer for me was, landscape photography, which is something that I had been interested in for a very long time. but it was definitely sort of like a background hobby that I did not have a lot of time to spend on. And I came to the realization that if I really wanted to get better at it, I had to spend some time on it. Like everything else, you only get better at it if you spend the time practicing. I decided that that was the right time for me to do that. Now, it was one of those things that where I had a little bit of anxiety about as well. I wasn't sure it was the right thing. I remember having a conversation with my boss at the time, and I shared with him where I was and what I was thinking about. I was seeking his advice and his wise counsel. And he told me something that hadn't occurred to me, but that made perfect sense. He said, well, this is something that you feel strongly about. You should try it. Worst case scenario, let's say in a year from now or 2 years or whatever, you want to come back in the tech industry, you can come back. You'll find something else to work on. We'll take you back. Don't worry about that. I was like, oh, well, I guess if you put it that way, that's actually a fairly low risk proposition then. Yeah, I should try it. And so that's what I ended up doing. And I've been spending my time on both landscape photography, which has been fantastic for me to be sort of like on the other side after having worked on all those creative products for so many years, to actually get to use those products to explore my creative vision. And then, as I mentioned, working also on some open source projects that are also on some passions of mine, including some things that are very obscure, I would say, or that have a very small audience, or that are non-commercial products nobody would buy. But there are things that I feel passionate about and enjoy working on. So to give you an example, one of the projects is a very geeky thing, but it's actually a software that allows you to transcribe English into the writings of the Lord of the Rings from Tolkien. Tolkien was a brilliant linguist and invented all these beautiful writing systems, but it turns out they're actually really difficult to do manually. When the question is, someone should do this, I was like, well, maybe I'm the one who should. And so I ended up writing this website called Tech and Deal that does just that. And it's been very fun. It's been a very interesting way to get connected, actually, with this whole community of Tolkien enthusiasts. So that's one thing. And then another, which is another passion of mine from ages ago, which is math typography. Again, that's a little bit geeky. It's very obscure as well. But it all started with a question that I had, which was, I wonder if it would be possible to essentially implement the tech layout algorithms in JavaScript. Is it even possible? I don't know. And I ended up exploring that a little bit, and I ended up writing an interactive editor for math equations that implement the tech layout algorithms, which is sort of like the reference for how you do beautiful layout of mathematics, but all interactive, all in JavaScript, so that it works in the browser, and so that people that need to input math in the browser can do it in a way that looks, as good as if they were writing it on the blackboard, or hopefully it looks even better than what they can do on the blackboard. And that's been a really interesting journey as well. Again, it's all open source on GitHub. The website is matlab.io. And there's a bunch of companies, mostly in the education space, that are using it to build software for interacting with students and so on. And that's been great. Lots of different fun things that scratch an itch for me, for something that I'm like, I wonder if that's possible, or that sounds kind of like interesting, and that I get to sort of explore and have fun with.
So definitely sounds like cool projects, open source projects, and some of these creative projects that you have. I'll make sure to put that in the show notes. You can share with me the links later. I'll make sure that the audience here can also follow if they're interested, especially the Tolkien fans or the math fans. And I must say, I've seen your photography as well. They look stunning, very beautiful, all these landscape pictures, and also the night photography, right? They look surreal to me. I don't know much about photography. When I see something that is beautiful, I just know that, okay, it's beautiful. But I know that it takes a lot of effort to produce such a picture. Arno, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Thanks so much for sharing your journey, your career, and all the lessons that you have. I wish you good luck in all the things that you do, your photography, your open source projects, and maybe one day we'll meet again.
That would be wonderful. Thank you so much, Henry. It's been a pleasure as well for me. Thanks again.
Thank you for listening to this episode and for staying right till the end. If you highly enjoyed, please share it with your friends and colleagues who you think would also benefit from listening to this episode. And if you're new to the podcast, make sure to subscribe and leave me your valuable review and feedback. It really helps me a lot in order to grow this podcast better. You can also find the full show notes of this conversation on the episode page at techleadjournal.dev website, including the full transcript, interesting quotes and links to the resources and mentions from the conversation. And lastly, make sure to subscribe to the show's mailing list on techleadjournal.dev to get notified for any future episodes. Stay tuned for the next Tech Lead Journal episode, and until then, goodbye.